The morning sun had barely cleared the rooftops of Virginia City when Clara May Sutton walked through the doors of the federal building. She did not walk in quietly. Not because she made noise. Clara May had spent 23 years learning how to move through the world without taking up too much space. She walked in quietly enough. But the room noticed her, the way a room notices something that doesn't fit the picture it has assembled of itself. Her dress was clean. She had seen to that, had washed it twice the night before in the basin behind the boarding house, and pressed it as best she could, with a heated iron wrapped in cloth. But the hem was frayed beyond saving. The left sleeve had been mended so many times the stitching had become its own pattern. The collar, which had once been white, had faded to the color of old cream. She carried a single leather satchel, worn smooth at the handles, containing everything she had prepared for this moment. She stopped at the front desk, looked the clerk directly in the eye. "Clara May Sutton," she said, "I have an interview at 9 o'clock. The clerk looked at her dress, looked back at her face. "Third floor," he said. "Try not to be late." Clara May thanked him, adjusted her satchel strap, and walked toward the stairs. Behind her, two men in pressed suits exchanged a glance. Neither of them said anything out loud. They didn't need to. Virginia City in the late years of the 1880s was a town in the process of deciding what it wanted to be when it grew up. The great silver boom that had made it famous, that had drawn thousands of men and women from every corner of the country with the glittering promise of wealth pulled from the earth, had quieted considerably. The mine still operated, but the wild, lawless electricity of the boom years had settled into something more structured, more institutional. Federal offices had arrived. Courts, a proper telegraph office, the kind of bureaucracy that follows money once money has decided to stay a while. The federal building on Carson Street was 4 stories of limestone and self-importance, built to communicate to anyone approaching it that the business conducted within its walls was serious business, conducted by serious people, and that the threshold between the street and its interior was not crossed without consequence. Clara May Sutton had crossed that threshold before, twice in fact, once to file paperwork on behalf of her employer, the widow Mrs. Hatch, and once to report the theft of a payroll box from the mining office where she had worked before that. Both times she had been received with the particular brand of courthouse courtesy extended to people of no particular standing, polite enough to be legal, dismissive enough to be clear. This time was different. This time she had an appointment. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had opened a regional office in Virginia City 8 months ago, tasked with addressing the growing problem of organized fraud, land theft, and violent crime that local law enforcement had proven either unable or unwilling to handle. It was a new organization, serious about establishing itself, and it had advertised, quietly, through channels that Clara May had spent considerable effort locating, for civilian investigators. People with specific skills, languages, accounting, local knowledge, the ability to move through communities that federal agents in their press suits could not easily penetrate. Clara May had spent 4 months preparing her application. She had taught herself to read Spanish from a dictionary borrowed from the library. She had documented, in meticulous detail, every instance of financial irregularity she had observed during 3 years of working in the mining office. She had written a 12-page analysis of the land fraud schemes operating in 3 counties, sourced entirely from public records that everyone had access to and no one had bothered to cross-reference. She had done all of this in the evenings, after 12-hour shifts, by the light of a single lamp in her rented room. She had done it in the dress she was wearing now, because it was the only one she owned. The interview room on the 3rd floor contained a long table and 5 men. Clara May assessed them in the 2 seconds between the door opening and her taking her seat across from them. Left to right, a heavy-set man with a gold watch chain who radiated the specific authority of someone accustomed to chairing things. Beside him, a younger man with a notepad and the careful expression of someone whose job was to write down what other people said. Then a gap. Then 2 men in federal uniforms who sat with the straight-back stillness of soldiers at rest. And at the far right end, slightly separated from the others, as if by choice, a man who was watching her with an attention that was different in quality from the rest. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair shot through at the temples with early gray. His jacket was federal issue, but he wore it with a looseness that suggested he had other identities beyond the one the jacket implied. He had a folder open in front of him and a pencil in his hand, but he hadn't looked at the folder once since she entered. His name, she would learn later, was Special Agent James Whitfield. He had come from Washington 3 weeks ago to oversee the regional office's first major investigation. He had read every application submitted for the civilian investigator position. He had read Clara May's application twice. The heavy-set man, Director Calhoun, spoke first. "Miss Sutton." He looked at her over the rims of his spectacles. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the appointment," she said. A pause. Calhoun's eyes moved, just briefly, just once, to her dress. She saw it. She had been seeing that particular eye movement her entire adult life. She kept her expression steady, and her hands still in her lap. "You understand," Calhoun said, "that the position you've applied for is a serious one. It requires someone of considerable, professional bearing. I understand the position requires analytical ability, language competency, and local knowledge," Clara May said. "I've documented my qualifications in the application materials." "Yes." He picked up the folder without opening it. "Your application was thorough." From the far end of the table, Agent Whitfield made a small sound that might have been agreement. Calhoun glanced at him. Whitfield looked at his folder. "Perhaps," said one of the uniformed men, "we should begin with the standard questions." "Of course," Clara May said. "I'm ready." The standard questions took 40 minutes. They asked about her education. She had attended the territorial school through age 14, then educated herself through every book she could borrow, buy secondhand, or read standing in the back of the library before closing time. They asked about her employment history: 3 years at the mining office, 18 months as household manager for Mrs. Hatch, 2 years before that doing accounts for a dry goods merchant who had paid her half what he would have paid a man for the same work. They asked about her language abilities. She demonstrated her Spanish by translating a paragraph from a document Calhoun produced, accurately, including a legal term that made the younger man with the notepad look up in surprise. Through all of it, the comments continued. Not loud, not direct, the kind of comments that exist in the space between words, in the slight emphasis placed on self-educated, in the pause before household manager, in the way Calhoun twice referred to her application materials as interesting, in a tone that made the word mean something smaller than it was. And twice, when she glanced toward the window or reached into her satchel for reference notes, she caught one of the uniformed men looking at her dress with an expression that he didn't bother to hide. She said nothing. She answered each question completely and moved to the next. At the 50-minute mark, Calhoun set down his folder and folded his hands on the table. "Miss Sutton," he said, "I think we've covered the professional qualifications adequately." A pause. "I wonder if I might ask you a more personal question." "You may ask," she said. "This position, civilian investigator, carries with it a certain public role. Meetings with community members, appearances at official proceedings, representation of this office." He paused again. "An investigator in this role would need to present themselves in a manner consistent with the standards of a federal institution." The room was very quiet. Clara May looked at Director Calhoun across the long table. She understood precisely what he was saying. She had understood it from the moment she walked through the door. She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she was choosing, with great care, which answer to give. "Director Calhoun," she said, "may I ask you something first?" He raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." "The land fraud analysis in my application, Section 4, pages 8 through 12. Did you read it?" A pause. "We reviewed your materials." "Yes. I'll be more specific." "The cross-referencing of deed registration records with water rights transfers across 3 counties. Did anyone on this panel read that section?" Silence. From the end of the table, Agent Whitfield said quietly, "I did." Clara May looked at him. He met her eyes directly. No performance, no condescension. Just attention. "Then you'll know," she said, still looking at Whitfield, "that the scheme I documented has defrauded approximately 47 families of land they legally owned, that it is ongoing, that it involves at least 2 individuals with connections to this building." She paused. "I identified that scheme working evenings by lamplight after 12-hour shifts, in this dress, Because it was the only dress I owned, and I needed to save my wages for reference materials and postage. She turned back to Calhoun. You asked about professional presentation, Director. I would suggest that the ability to identify a 47-family fraud operation from public records, in one's spare time, with no institutional support, she paused, is a form of professional presentation. It simply isn't the form you were looking at. The room was absolutely silent. The younger man with the notepad had stopped writing. One of the uniformed men had leaned forward slightly without appearing to notice he had done so. Director Calhoun looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at his folder, and this time he opened it. It was Agent Whitfield who asked the question that changed everything. He had been quiet for most of the interview, present, attentive, but allowing the formal process to run its course. Now he leaned forward slightly and set down his pencil. Miss Sutton, he said, I have one more question, and I want you to know before I ask it that it is not a standard interview question. You can decline to answer it. Clara May looked at him steadily. Ask it. The families in your report, he said. The 47 families who lost their land. You documented each one by name. Individual families, individual circumstances. He paused. That level of detail goes considerably beyond what was necessary to establish the pattern of fraud. You could have made the same analytical point with aggregate numbers. Another pause. Why did you include the individual families? The room waited. Clara May was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to become something else. Not hesitation, but the particular stillness of a person deciding how much of the truth to offer. Because they are not a pattern, she said finally. They are people. She opened her satchel and removed a single sheet of paper, not from her application materials, something separate, and placed it on the table. The Moreno family, she said. Rafael and Consuela Moreno. They came from Sonora in 1871. They filed their land claim legally. They built a house, planted an orchard, raised 4 children on that land. In 1886, they received notice that their deed had been found invalid due to a registration error, an error that was not an error. They lost everything. She paused. Mrs. Moreno does laundry now, in the building 2 blocks from here. I pass her every morning. She looked at Whitfield directly. I included the individual families because someone should say their names in a room like this. Because the people in rooms like this make decisions about patterns and schemes and aggregate numbers. And sometimes, in doing that, they forget that every number is a family. Her voice remained steady. The Morenos lost an orchard. The Henderson family lost 3 generations of work. The Yazzie family, she stopped, breathed once. The Yazzie family's youngest son died the winter after they lost their land. They couldn't afford a doctor. Complete silence. The younger man with the notepad was not writing. He was looking at the table. One of the uniformed men, the one who had looked at her dress twice, was looking at his hands. Director Calhoun's gold watch chain caught the light as he breathed. Agent Whitfield was looking at Clara May with an expression that had moved entirely beyond the professional and into the territory of something older and more honest. Miss Sutton, he said. His voice was different now, quieter, stripped of its official register. What do you want from this position? I want to stop it, she said simply. I want the Morenos to get their land back. I want the person in this building who is connected to this scheme to be held accountable. I want the 47 families on that list to have someone in a federal office who knows their names. She folded her hands on the table. That's what I want from the position. Director Calhoun made a sound, not a word, just a sound. He removed his spectacles, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Whitfield picked up his pencil, opened his folder, and wrote something at the top of the page. The letter arrived at Clara May's boarding house 11 days later. She was mending the sleeve of her dress, the left one, the one that had been mended so many times, when Mrs. Hatch knocked on her door and handed her the envelope with the federal seal. She set down her needle, opened it carefully, read it twice. Then she sat very still for a moment, in her small room, with the late afternoon light coming through the single window, and the letter in her hands, and the needle and thread still on the table beside her. Dear Miss Sutton, following careful review of your application and interview, we are pleased to offer you the position of Civilian Investigator, Grade 1, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Virginia City Regional Office. Your start date, should you accept, would be the 15th of next month. There was a handwritten note at the bottom, below the official signature. The Moreno family's case has been opened for review. J. Whitfield Clara May Sutton reported to the federal building on the 15th. She wore the same dress. She had decided, with the particular clarity that comes to people who have fought long enough for something to stop pretending otherwise, that she would wear it until she had earned enough from this position to buy a new one. Not because she was ashamed of it, she had stopped being ashamed of it somewhere in the middle of the third-floor interview room, but because it was honest, because it was hers, because every mended stitch in it was a record of the work she had done to get to this door. Agent Whitfield met her in the lobby. He shook her hand, formally, correctly, with the professional gravity appropriate to the occasion. Then he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "The panel voted unanimously, Miss Sutton, in case you wondered." She looked at him. "Even Director Calhoun?" "Calhoun was the one who wrote your name at the top of the list." A pause. He said, and I am quoting him directly, that he had never in 30 years of federal service heard anyone say the things you said in that room. Clara May looked at the lobby around her, the limestone walls, the federal seal above the door, the clerk at the front desk, who had told her not to be late. "Neither had I," she said honestly, "until I said them." She picked up her satchel, the same one, worn smooth at the handles, and walked toward the stairs. Behind her, the door to the federal building closed with the solid, certain sound of a threshold properly crossed. Some rooms are built to keep certain people out. And some people walk into those rooms anyway, in worn dresses, with the truth in their satchel and the names of 47 families in their heart. And they say what needs to be said until the room has no choice but to listen. Clara May Sutton had always known how to be that person. She had simply been waiting for the right room.